Then welcome to the evening session. This is going to be the last session. It's on academic skills, and I hope everybody has some experience in this field. The first presenter is Petersen, and he will present us how a serious game supports elementary school history classes in teaching about the bombardment of Copenhagen in 1807.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Microphones work and everything?
Yeah.
That's good. So yes, hello everybody. My name is Strømberg Petersen. And yeah, together with some peers from my research group, MEGA, which stands for Media Innovation and Game Research, we've written this paper about a serious game that we've made. Yes, the paper is titled How a Serious Game Supports Elementary School History Classes in Teaching About the Bombardment of Copenhagen in 1807. So, as for the introduction, the research question in the paper was, can a serious game be engaging and improve learning outcomes about the history of the Copenhagen bombardment in 1807 for Danish elementary school pupils in the 7th grade? So we chose this topic largely because it's a stable part of the Danish school curriculum. All students have to go through it, and it normally happens in like the early teen years between age 12 and 15. Reading history and reading history texts quickly involves a lot of complexity, especially when including older texts and actually reading texts from when the historic events took place. And this came from around 1807. Yeah, and because of these very complex and difficult texts to read, there's a big dip in the motivation in the subject of history. It's very clear to see in the Danish students that around age 12, 13, there's a large dip in the motivation towards this subject. Yeah, and we kind of wanted to try and do something about that. So before we jump into the juicy serious game design principles and all this cool stuff, I wanted to give a quick overview of what the Bombardment of Copenhagen actually was. So back in the beginning of the 1800s, the Danish had a very large fleet and was a very large military power. At the time we were a neutral country, even though there were a lot of conflicts, especially between France and Britain, where Napoleon expanded a lot, which made the British very uncertain. The British therefore feared that France would invade Denmark and kind of take over the fleet and take over the oceans surrounding Denmark. Britain therefore gave Denmark an ultimatum to give up their neutrality, which the king wouldn't accept, and then we got bombed, pretty much. The bombardment started, the fleet was lost, a lot of it stolen, and the battle is considered a big turning point in Danish history, where Denmark went from a large military power to, well, a lot less so. Yes, as for our previous research in developing this serious game, we used this framework that we created earlier in our research group. It kind of separates the process of creating a serious game into three large portions, which are the foundation, the game design, and the prototype and implementation. As for the foundation section, the most important thing is to get an overview of the subject and the content that you actually want to create the serious game about. And you would do this by getting in contact with experts, potential stakeholders in the projects, and so on, to also ensure that there would be a manageable scope that makes sense, and also identifying who it is you're making a game for and what kind of access do you have to this target group. Yeah, together with experts, it's very important from the foundation to create these learning objectives which will shape the entire game. The game design portion should be seen as a bunch of different game design principles that are good to consider, at least. But also, it's not necessary to use all of them in every game. It's important to kind of prioritize and leave some out, depending on the game you're making. Sometimes challenge and like the skill level of a game is very important, whereas other games, for example this, we focused more on the narrative surrounding this historic event and creating narrative engagement through, for example, how the characters interacted with the player. The last section of the framework is circular. This is kind of to symbolize that we hope people will do it as many times as they can before actually launching the product. Because it's about prototyping and testing, pilot testing this prototype, and then doing the changes that should be done. Yeah, so we talked about the expert involvement. In this case, we used a teacher a lot. And we used a teacher from very early on in the process, which helped us a lot. From the previous short summary of the bombardment, I'm sure it became somewhat clear to all of you that history quickly can become very complex. I left it very open-ended, but there were a lot of motives from both Britain and France and Denmark. They all have different interests and stuff like that, so there's a lot to go deeper into. So it quickly becomes very complex. The way that history is typically taught in history class is that you start at the outcome. So start at this historic event, the war, the conflict, whatever it is, and then you kind of go back in time and look at how did it escalate and how did it end up where it ended up. That means that showing the outcome is kind of the first introduction to a new subject, and that's where in the education often a film or small film clips are used to kind of pique the interest and show what happened. And that's where we really thought that a serious game could maybe be used to showcase this, but also include more interactivity into this and make it a bit more engaging in this way. A big focus on our game design was to try and have good narrative engagement. We tried to do this. Well, the game kind of functions as this introduction to the conflict, to the bombardment, and the way we tried to include narrative engagement was through characters, especially. We tried to have different characters with different personality traits and using a different language, speaking in different ways. And the player also has his own role to kind of live and be inside of this historical event. Overall, looking at game design, the gameplay focused a lot on going around to different characters such as guards and gathering information that would kind of send you to the next events. Most dialogue in the game is, all the dialogue in the game is voiced, and most of it is also shown in dialogue boxes, as you can see on this image, which had very good effects to kind of have both the voice and the dialogue as text. One thing that proved a little bit difficult was the world building, because it took place in this very large city, and we wanted it to feel like this large city, but also we didn't have that much gameplay, and we didn't want people to get lost inside this big city, so we had to limit a lot of stuff with still trying to make it feel like a large space. Yes, one element, one game design thing that I want to emphasize, that we tried to emphasize in the game, was the element of surprise. So literature states how linking a surprising element that increases arousal with the learning goals has very good outcomes or very good potential. However, it can be very difficult to kind of link this surprise with learning objectives. I've had a lot of trouble with that in earlier projects, at least. Sometimes it doesn't work as it doesn't really work as well as intended. In this case, we tried to do it through the soundscape mainly. So in a talk about peace and war times, and when there were peace and when there was war and stuff in Denmark, there's like a partial flashback in the soundscape to the explosions and to the action, which seems to have had quite a nice effect on this specific learning objective. Going through the methodology of this project and the methods, we had a total of 22 participants. The participants were all 7th grade students. It was 2 classes. And the experimental, they were separated into an experimental and control group with 11 in each group. The experimental group played the game as the introduction to this subject, and the control group did an analog read, which would have been the normal scenario in teaching this class. Afterwards, we asked them some questions based on the user engagement scale, slightly tailored to this specific experience. We asked them some knowledge questions that were based on the learning objectives created in collaboration with the teachers. And then we had some qualitative interviews to kind of understand better why questions were answered as they were. Yeah, so these are the results from the user engagement scale based questions, where we can see that the aesthetic appeal, the engrossment and the enjoyment of the game were lower than expected, and based on the oral feedback from the interviews, this was because there was a lot of confusion about what to do and sometimes getting lost. However, the question 2.2 states the opposite, so there was some confusion regarding this. For the knowledge-based questions based on the learning objectives, we can see that overall there were quite a lot more correct answers from the experimental group. However, the questions, question 2 and 4, which were in the middle of the game, were not clearly enough communicated in the game, which the results showed. The attention and the motivation in the game seemed to dip towards the middle. And this was also because they were communicated, most of the learning objectives were communicated through the dialogue and the voiceover at the same time, so you could follow the text very directly. And these two were only done through voiceover. So when you started to kind of create the standard that both media, both the visual reading and the voice is used, then you should not take one away. That at least proved not optimal in this case. For the qualitative interviews, it was clear that the learning outcome theme was the most discussed. A lot of people really liked how simple it was to get into this game very quickly, and very quickly gain a good understanding of the event as a whole. However, on the negative side, a lot of people thought that it was too shallow of an overview, and felt like they would get more information if they were to read it in a traditional sense, which I can definitely see where they're coming from. Asking about how we manage with the narrative and the usage of the characters, it seems that this was received very positively. Cool. The conclusion of the project, some of the successes was how we did the narrative and used the characters to kind of move this forward. The different personalities worked really well. The surprise, not a huge success, but it had a positive effect. Looking at comparing the learning objective linked to the surprise versus the other learning objectives. Some of the failures was, as I mentioned, in the middle of the game, the attention and the motivation to continue dipped a little bit, which was also because we didn't use the approach that we used throughout the rest of the game, with having both voiced and dialogue boxes. Regarding the game kind of being not deep enough and not learning enough from the game, we would have loved if we could make a bunch more learning goals and have them kind of as secondary and tertiary learning goals, so it would really reward the students that wanted to dive deeper in the game and really bring their attention and try to get as much from the game as they could. Because as the game is right now, they're not really rewarded for doing that. Yes, so serious games as a tool in schools, it's really both students and teachers are really positive towards it and really want it more in the education. However, it's not for everyone and it's not for every scenario. Some students don't really like it as a medium, so it's all about finding the right fit. But I think the most important part is to have it as a teacher in the toolbox to be able to use in specific cases or to specific students, not necessarily the entire class all the time. Yeah, and the project was kind of very much focused on this expert involvement, which was key, and using the teachers very early on to ensure that the use case the game is created for makes sense and would be used by, in this case, the teacher. Yeah, that was my talk. I once again quickly want to thank my research group, Media Innovation and Game Research. We try and do some serious games for school and especially reading engagement. So if you're interested in that, check out some of the projects that we made. But thank you.
Okay, thank you for the talk. Any questions? Anybody?
I had a question about you. I really liked how that you wanted to investigate how surprise can impact the learning and so on and so forth. But I just had a question. You said that you used, in order to kind of evoke this feeling of surprise, right? You used something. It was a flashback. Was that it? Flashback with the sounds of the bombing. Yeah. Is that the only thing that you did when you wanted to try to kind of, embed surprise or the element of surprise in the game? Is that the only one, or is there others?
No, it was the main one. We also tried to do it in a few different ways.
Okay.
As I talked about, we put a lot of emphasis on the personality of the characters, and that some of them would be kind of quirky and not very, like, you can't predict what they're going to say.
Right.
So in that case, some dialogue may have taken a surprising turn and a little bit wacky sometimes, which also seemed to work somewhat good.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Any more questions? Nobody has a question, that's also okay. I think a few people want to catch their flights. So we'll just go on. And the next presentation is going on.